the silent prodigy. At precisely 8 a.m., the old clock on the wall of Brookstone Middle School in Houston ticked forward, its hands steady despite the noise that filled the classroom. Rays of sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting lines of gold across scratched wooden desks, each marked with initials and faint doodles from restless students before. The chatter of voices, the scraping of chairs, and the occasional thud of a book being dropped into a backpack created a familiar cacophony. But in the farthest corner of room 12B, there was a quietness that contrasted sharply with the chaos. Sitting there was a boy. His name was Malik Johnson, 13 years old, dark-skinned with tightly coiled hair that he never bothered to comb carefully. He was always there, quiet, still, almost blending into the background as if he wished to disappear entirely. His head often rested in his palm, his gaze fixed out the window at things no one else seemed to notice. Birds on the power lines. Clouds shifting shape. Leaves caught in gusts of wind. Malik had perfected the art of being invisible. No one really paid attention to him. Most didn't even remember he was there unless they needed someone to joke about. He didn't cause trouble, didn't talk much, and never raised his hand to answer questions. To his classmates, he was a shadow that drifted behind them in the hallways. But what they didn't know was that behind that quiet gaze was a mind that calculated faster than the clocks they watched, and a passion for numbers that no one had ever seen. His life outside of school was harder than any of them knew. His father, once a U.S. Army Ranger, had returned home with scars that weren't visible but just as real. He worked the graveyard shift as a security guard at a shipping yard, coming home long after the rest of the world was asleep, so tired he could barely climb into his recliner before drifting off. Malik's mother took on 3 different jobs, cleaning houses, working the early morning shift at a diner, and sewing clothes for a neighbor's alterations business at night. There was no choice. Rent was late more often than not, and the bills stacked up no matter how hard they worked. Malik was the eldest of 2. His little sister, Maya, was just 7, and he watched over her as best as he could. He made sure she did her homework, ate dinner, even if it was just cold cereal, and got to bed on time. When his mother got home late, he stayed up to help her carry in groceries or rub the ache from her feet. After that, when the house was finally quiet, he would sit at the kitchen table under a dim light and open books the school had long since abandoned. Algebra, geometry, even pre-calculus, although it wasn't in his curriculum yet. His notebooks were filled with scribbled equations, complex problems he'd made up just to challenge himself. He should have been in 9th grade by now. But Malik had missed too many days. He had stayed home to care for Maya when she was sick, worked odd jobs when his mother needed extra help, and sometimes just didn't have the energy to go. The school system didn't care much about the reasons. They only saw his attendance records. And so, he was held back a grade. Being the oldest in class made him stand out in the worst possible way. "That's the kid who flunked 8th grade," some whispered as he walked in. "But he still counts with his fingers," others snickered. At first, their words hurt. But over time, Malik learned to keep quiet, to stay still and silent until they stopped looking at him. He figured that if he didn't make a sound, they'd forget he was even there. What they never noticed was how easily he solved problems they found impossible. While his classmates struggled to balance equations or figure out ratios, Malik played with far more difficult concepts. His notebooks were packed not with the simple exercises the teachers handed out, but with advanced theories and problems he created for himself. He solved them not because anyone asked him to, but because he loved to. Numbers made sense. They didn't judge him. They didn't laugh. They were either right or wrong, simple as that. Malik didn't care about his grades. He didn't need praise. He just wanted to stay in his corner, unnoticed, quietly doing what he loved. But that day, everything changed. The call-out. The morning sun was high in the sky when Ms. Elaine Carter stood at the front of room 12B. She was an experienced math teacher with over 2 decades under her belt. Tall, stern-faced, her short gray hair always neatly styled, she had a reputation for being no-nonsense. To her, hard work was everything. Students who didn't participate, who didn't show effort, weren't worth her time. And in her mind, Malik Johnson was one of them. She had noticed him, of course. A teacher always notices the ones who drift too far away. He was always in the corner, looking out the window, barely opening his notebook, never raising his hand. She had watched him for months, thinking he was another student who didn't care, who had given up. But that morning, Miss Carter was in a foul mood. She had stayed up late grading papers, and the results were dismal. Sloppy work. Incorrect answers. Students making the same mistakes she had corrected time and time again. She was fed up. And then she found something she hadn't expected. A perfect score on the last test. Every step in the solution was flawless. The reasoning was crystal clear. No errors. Not a single careless mistake. She squinted at the name on the paper. Malik Johnson. Her first thought was that he had cheated, but there were no signs of copying. It wasn't a hasty answer sheet. It was meticulous. It was brilliant. Miss Carter didn't like surprises, and she hated when students hid their talents. She saw it as disrespectful toward her, toward the subject, and toward the classroom. So she decided to test him. Malik Johnson, she said loudly. The room fell silent. Heads turned. Malik slowly lifted his chin from his hand, his heart thumping in his chest. Miss Carter's gaze was sharp, unwavering. Come to the board, she ordered. Whispers broke out instantly. He's gonna mess up. Why's she calling on him? He never talks. Malik stood, his legs stiff as stone. He hated the feeling of eyes on him. He could hear the snickering, the muttered insults. He was used to them. But this was different. He was being dragged out into the open. You can't hide forever. He heard his father's voice in his head from years ago. Words that stuck with him. He took a breath and walked to the front of the class. Miss Carter handed him a marker. Solve this, she said. She wrote an equation on the whiteboard, one that wasn't in their textbook. It was complex, filled with variables and functions most 8th graders hadn't seen yet. A trap. Malik stared at it. He knew it instantly. He had worked on problems like this before. Harder ones, even. For a moment, fear clawed at him. But then, something shifted. His love for numbers outweighed his fear of failure. He picked up the marker. The breakthrough. At first, Malik's hand moved slowly. He mapped the problem in his mind, plotting each step before he wrote anything down. But then his movements became faster, smoother. He found the pattern. He broke the problem apart into manageable pieces, solving each with precision. The room grew quiet. Whispers stopped. Chairs creaked as students leaned forward to watch. No one laughed anymore. He's actually doing it, someone muttered. Miss Carter's sharp eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Malik's breathing steadied. The numbers made sense. His hand didn't hesitate. The solution unfolded on the board, clean and clear. Finally, he placed the marker down and turned to face the class. Silence. Miss Carter stepped forward, her eyes flicking over the solution, scrutinizing every line. Malik held his breath. After what felt like hours, she nodded. Correct. Gasps erupted. Then applause. First tentative, then louder. Malik stood there, not sure what to do. He wasn't used to applause. But inside, something shifted. He wasn't invisible anymore. And there was no going back. The story behind the silence. After class, Miss Carter asked Malik to stay behind. Why have you hidden this talent? She asked. Malik hesitated. Then he answered quietly, I didn't think anyone cared. For the first time, Miss Carter truly looked at him. She realized she had never asked about his life. Never wondered why he was held back. Malik told her about his family, his responsibilities, his long nights. How he stayed up late studying, not for anyone else, but because he loved it. Miss Carter nodded slowly. I owe you an apology, she said. And I think we can do something about your future. A new beginning. The next week, Malik found himself nominated for the district's advanced math program. He wasn't sure he belonged at first. But Ms. Carter insisted. She told him he was a warrior, someone who fought battles quietly but came out stronger. In the advanced class, Malik was surrounded by the best students in the city. But he held his own. He raised his hand. He stood at the board. He solved problems faster than most. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to hide. Malik's promise. That night, sitting under the dim light at his kitchen table, Malik wrote in his notebook. Not numbers this time, but dreams. I will never be afraid again. He listed his goals: to win the state math competition, to earn a scholarship to a prestigious school, to prove he was more than anyone had ever believed. And he would do it. Because Malik Johnson was no longer invisible. He was unstoppable.